Welcome back, everyone. The title of today's podcast is When Organic Makes the Grade. And I know that in my past podcasts, I have said some negative things about vegetables and particularly grains. And I just want to assure everyone that I can distinguish the baby from the bathwater. And just as I don't like it when all types of meat raising is grouped together, and that I see of huge distinction between factory farming and feedlots and rotational grazing of meats. There's a big difference between the way a lot of conventional vegetables are grown, and particularly grains, and those that are really trying to do it regeneratively. Personally, I'm spoiled rotten. I have access to all kinds of really good organic vegetables grown very locally. Some of it's right next door, the farm next door with organic CSA. And it's really great to be able to get vegetables there from people that I know are trying really hard to be regenerative, to trying to leave their soil more fertile than it began, and to not cause damage. But the reality is that vegetable farmings have extra challenges in order to be regenerative. And if I do say negative things about vegetables and particularly grains, I want to be very clear, put my cards out on the table right away, that if I have an agenda, it's to argue that most people out there have a notion that plant-based diet is the real ecological way to go, and the way to, be the best steward of the earth and whatnot. And I really don't believe that is accurate. And I think that doesn't actually take into reality. And while animals can be some of the worst causes of environmental degradation when done right, actually there's nothing that can compare to their ability to participate and sequester carbon and to grow soil and all that we've talked about. And so, not that vegetables are bad, but in a sense dethroning them as the pinnacle and the epitome of the ecological diet, and to put animals back in the place of where they belong. And then after doing that, I do hope that many of these people, because I think the vast majority of people who are vegetarian aren't necessarily doing it just for their own bodies or just because they have a hard time with the idea of killing things, but they're really doing it for the environment. And I want them to know that I am their ally. I'm trying to accomplish, and I care about the same things they do, and I'm doing it through systems that have evolved to do exactly what regenerative things that we want to happen in nature. So I'm going to break it down into two challenges, sort of two categories of challenges that I see that vegetables have to face. And I think that I have too much to say about each one, that I'm going to have to make this a two-part series. And so to approach it conceptually, before we get down into the more granular practical nuts and bolts of what's going on, I kind of see a contrast of different systems. So you have two different kinds of efficiencies. So there's nature's efficiency, and she's all about diversity of species and diversities of systems. And you have just oodles and oodles of different kinds of organisms all interacting with each other with a healthy amount of competition, with an appropriate amount of stress. And in that, so for instance, that's the kind of efficiency that you're tapping into with a pasture, right? So a pasture it's really, you don't plow it up, at least wheat. There may be people who do this, but I think the better way is not to just plow it up and to plant Timothy grass just for your horses, or just, to have one kind of crop. Ultimately, the rotational grazer is looking for that diversity. So we have tons of different kinds of grasses, and we have legumes and broadleafs, and we have a whole range, multiple types of species going on. And part of that goes back to that solar panel and capturing the sunlight. So, all the different angles that the sun's out, that you have grasses, the tall, skinny blades that stick up, vertically. Then you have broadleaf things that are flatter, and you have a whole array of photosynthesis and things capturing the light at all these different angles, but it goes far more than that, right? So you have grasses that are, they do really well in heat, or you have grasses that do really well when it's cold, or you have grasses that do well when it's dry, or when it's, when it's wet. You have some that, go far into the winter and retain a lot of the nutrition. You have some legumes in there, and they're fixing nitrogen, and they're high in protein. You have deeper rooted plants, and they're bringing up minerals to the top. So it goes on and on. They all have these little different niches, and seasons are always changing, and so they all kind of thrive, and they may sort of dominate more in what time, at certain times and whatnot. But there's this sort of healthy competition going on. They're all vying, and they just fill up the space, and it's quite chaotic. But within that chaos is this gorgeous sort of efficiency and abundance. And so the rotational grazer is just sort of tapping into that efficiency, sticking the ruminants in there to help condition that and provide that appropriate amount of competition and cutting the grass back, and then it grows back, and that whole system. And when you participate in that, you're just kind of, as the farmer, you're gleaning all this excess abundance that you can take off, and the system remains fully intact. And the opposite kind of efficiency is, from our scientific method. So the scientific method, especially when you're doing research or whatnot, you're narrowing your scope. You're trying to get down to just one variable, and you control for all the others. So you take care of everything else, and you're really narrowing into one variable. And, this is the efficiency of the factory. This is the efficiency of industry and technology, right? So, whereas a person who's on an assembly line, might get carpal tunnel syndrome and just go mad and crazy for the repetition, we can easily make, we can get a robot, and it makes the same movement over and over. That more simple and repetitive lends itself very easily to technology and mechanized. And it's this efficiency of just not the whole chaotic whole, but it's the efficiency of the individual, the efficiency of that single variable. And just by the very nature of what you're selling and what you're farming, a vegetable farmer has to fall into that category. And this is just by necessity, right? I mean, if you've got an order for, 2 bushels of beans and a couple bushels of tomatoes or whatever, you don't frolic around a pasture with a basket picking a bean here and a tomato there until you fill them up. You gotta have one area where you've designated, okay, this half acre here is for tomatoes, or this quarter acre, whatever the number is, is for beans, and this section here is only for cucumbers, for lettuce, whatever. So that when you go, you pick, you have to have that sort of mechanical efficiency to sort of meet the demand that we're looking for there. You're not some cow or sheep that just goes out there and eats what's there and just grabs it all together and mixes it all in. You're selling beans, you're selling tomatoes. And so what happens is you have to take out all the competition. And the main and dominant way to do that is to till and to plow. And we have a long history of this, right? This is all the way back from when the pioneers came, and there was this gorgeous, gorgeous soil where the buffalo had been roaming in the grasslands, where we just tore up the grasslands, or, that was much easier than when you would have to, cut the trees down and whatnot. But what they would do is they would plow, and they would tear up that earth, and they would plant their stuff, and they would kind of use that land up. And then they would move on, and then keep moving west or wherever they're moving. And, they would leave, and when there's not too many people, eventually that land would kind of heal over and go fallow, and the systems would begin to rev up again. But as more and more people settled here, and all the Indians had been killed off or died of disease, right? But then we started filling it up with other people. Then the long history kind of culminated in the early 1900s when we had the Dust Bowl, and many people forget that the Dust Bowl was not a function of drought. It was a function of the plow. And then when the systems just kind of ground to a halt and the rains did not come, there was no resilience, and it just literally blew away the soil as dust, and they lost hundreds of millions of acres. I mean, the numbers are staggering. But the sad thing is, even though that kind of woke up our culture, and even the government and the agriculture Department of Agriculture started having soil conservation requirements, and the attempts to get back control and conserve that soil. The sad history is that it's continued to basically erode away. And so we have lost some 30% of what used to be our soils here. I don't know the exact numbers. I get very overwhelmed very quickly. I hear the figure 6 billion tons, metric tons, or whatever, cubic metric tons. And to me, it's just so astronomical. I can't even comprehend. They say that we used to measure it in feet of the topsoil in the Midwest, and now we measure it in inches. And, that's lifeblood, going straight, just most of it's going right, it ends up in the ocean. And that's a function of tilling. And there's a misconception, I think, that we have to take care of right away, and that the idea that you gotta fluff up that soil so that the seeds will germinate, and then the roots will be able to get the nutrients out of the soil. It's a total myth, and that's not why we till, and it's not remotely true, because it's certainly not true in a pasture. But what's going on is, because of that scientific method, is that you're trying to raise, you're trying to grow just one kind of a vegetable or grain in that area. And so you have to take care of all the competition. And tilling is a way to wipe the slate clean, right? And I'm often reminded of Michael Pollan. He writes a section, and forgetting right now which book. It might be in The Botany of Desire. Read these books a long time ago. But he talks about, and anytime because this goes down all the way to the gardener, right? So much of what I'm talking about is very easy and applicable to you see the monocropped grain growing in the Midwest, where you just for miles and miles, you can just take that tractor and draw a straight line for 5-10 miles, and you just But the same is true also for the gardener, the home gardener, or even the small vegetable farmer, and Michael Pollan talked about how you begin and you try to set order to your garden, and that's like the Apollo, the Roman god Apollo of order, and you got these straight lines, and there's a certain beauty that we enjoy and our mind likes about that. I got my beans here, and I got my cucumbers here, and my zucchini here, and you got it all planned out and everything. But by the end, he said Dionysus always wins in the end, and she turns it all into chaos. And the reason why that happens is because the soil and the grass and everything that's covering the soil is like the earth's skin, right? So as soon as you plow and you scratch it up, you've taken a layer off, and immediately the systems there just want to cover it up. And the first and foremost important part of that is just mechanical, right? So the roots of the plants is what keeps the soil just mechanically, structurally intact. I mean, that's very oversimplified. But if you've got plants growing with roots in the ground, not only do you keep, you sort of break the velocity of the raindrops that would hit the bare dirt, but also when the water starts running, those roots and all the functions and ecosystems and things around the roots are holding that soil in mechanically so that it doesn't flow down and run into the waterways. And so this is the first and foremost hurdle that the vegetable grower has to deal with, because in order to make a business of it, you have to use the scientific method of narrowing down to one variable. And so how do we mitigate that, right? So it used to be you would till, and then you would plant your stuff, and then you would go back over, and you would often till just to keep the weeds down until that crop that you're trying to grow has dominated and it's taken up most of the space. And then from there, you can do less tilling, but that was the main thing, right? And so what, in terms of dealing with that hurdle, suddenly you have to approach, you get the, what people call, no tilling, or you get, less tilling or whatnot. So things I know that to mitigate for this is, there's a lot of people that they may till once and start with a blank slate. And then as things are growing up, they, try not to disturb it too much. And they're pushing down the seeds into the ground without disturbing the soil too much, drilling, they drill the seeds in. And then, some people I know cultivate, well, it's another word for plowing or tilling, but it's really you're getting rid of the weeds, and they might just have these implements that are just taking off the top inch, right? So this is all about a mitigation again, right? Trying to do less damage, because nature really wants to heal that scab over and have a gazillion different species, and she's gonna keep, all those seeds are gonna keep germinating, and the weeds are gonna come, whatever's gonna come. Those forces of how in the environment and nature works is they're going to try to fill that place with as many species. So it's a constant battle to keep back all that competition, to control for all those other variables. And so some people are, just shaving off, the top inch, and so what you end up doing is you're taking out all those weeds and all the roots of the weeds, and so, but you haven't disturbed the soil too far down. And another way of dealing with this as well is mulching. So people mulch, once they've got their plants in, and they can maybe put hay around, or maybe they prefer wood chips depending on what kind of plant it is. Or some people I know are putting black plastic. And in each of these cases, you're sort of making a compromise. So you're not, the systems, aren't like revving up at 200% where nature wants to be, and in having all this diversity, whatever. But at the same time, you're not destroying the soil. So you're mitigating a whole lot of damage. So you're managing to keep a lot of the moisture in the ground. You're managing to keep a lot of the structure intact. And, you're not having the erosion issues of all that soil running down into the oceans. And the thing is, that structure is so much more than just the roots holding things together, right? You've got your worms, and you've got your fungus, you've got your bacteria, and all these systems that have to work symbiotically. It's like this economy going on in there, and it takes a little while for things to get going. And whether it's worms digging tunnels, and their vermicastings being brought to the top and providing more nutrients, the soil is very complicated, and it has to accomplish sort of two very contradictory things at the same time. So the soil needs to be able to hold water, as well as being able to hold oxygen, because it needs both of those things. And so, kind of what happens is you have, again, this is the diversity. So you have what you call aggregates. So your soil is, basically it clumps together in different sizes. And in those different sizes, when you have a smaller area and a smaller pore, a smaller hole, the water stays in there, and just the the way water works, it sort of holds itself, and it's going to stay in those smaller areas, and it takes a lot more force to, because it sort of cohedes to itself. And the bigger holes, and I think those would be like maybe wormholes or, where roots have died or whatnot, then a lot of that water drains out and there's more oxygen available in there. But it's a very complicated, and of course this crazy balancing act of homeostasis, sort of balancing act of things that are being used for both water and oxygen. Because if it all filled with water, there'd be no room for oxygen, and then, their own way, all the animals, all the critters, all the plants and everything, they have to have oxygen to sort of breathe in a way. But if you don't have water too, they're all going to die if they don't get their water. So that structure that happens is very complicated. So you've got, bacteria, and they oftentimes are living in their own sort of ooze because that's the environment. They need to be moist. And then you've got fungus that's also has to have a certain environment. So they're all kind of putting out this sort of gooey stuff, and that's holding together a lot of these soil particles. And so every time you disturb that, right, even if you're just disturbing it once a year to, you just start with that clean slate, you're setting the systems back to zero. And so that's a big challenge, whereas our pastures, it's been decades and decades and decades of having been intact. Those systems they're at full throttle, and they're working to sequester all that carbon, and they're working to, get that water in and retain that water with all that organic matter, and as well as keep on building that soil. So that challenge in mind is actually, I want to venture out into a discussion that I've been very reluctant to go to, but I think finally this is the context that needs to be, GMOs need to be talked about, right? So, and when you're at market and you're talking with customers, people care about the environment, and they care about what's going in their bodies. And, they're very anti-GMO, and understandably, but I think almost all the time, the discussion of GMOs is never in the proper context. And I believe that once we understand what's going on with tilling, and once we understand what's going on with that soil and its need to stay intact, and remembering that we've gone through a period where we've pretty much lost our soil and it stopped working, is that within the system, these huge farms, the vast majority of how we raise grain and vegetables, that plowing there is how they control for those variables. Because that's something that mechanically and technology and machines can do. Putting a mulch and other things oftentimes requires a lot of manual labor, and that's not the direction that conventional farming has gone. It's become less and less farmers and more technology. So in that context, I imagine someone at Monsanto, who may have been very ecologically minded, came up with the brilliant idea of Roundup, right? And so we're all very concerned about glyphosate and what it's doing, but in their mind and in reality, right? So if your choice again is between tilling and spraying, okay, well, I should explain the whole Roundup for those who may not quite remember what's going on there, but right, so they have, especially like your corn and your soya, they have genetically modified these plants so that they're resistant to this herbicide, right? And so why would they spray herbicides? It's again to take care of all that competition. But so when they can do this, they can, even when the plant is up, so this is not, it can be done originally to do a clean slate, but this can also be done when the corn or soy has already come up. They can now spray this herbicide, and it'll kill everything but the plant that's been genetically modified. And so this has mitigated tilling. right? So that's really an ecological argument for GMOs, right? And so if we don't talk about GMOs within that context and in terms of what it's mitigating, we kind of miss the idea, right? Normally we're concerned about glyphosate and we're concerned about all that poison. But I always have to remind people that, if we're talking about glyphosate versus, organic CSA vegetable farm, I'm absolutely with you. But if we're talking about 95% of how food is grown, and you have a choice between glyphosate that kills all the foliage of the plants, it actually, in comparison to a lot of the other herbicides, is actually, in comparison, is not nearly as destructive, is not nearly as toxic, right? So the claim is that it's not going into the roots. It's leaving the soil intact, and it's just taking care of the foliage. Whereas, and I know that there are people who are trying really hard out there with studies to show that it's more involved with that, and I have no doubt that it creeps into the systems much more than that. But that always has to be taken into account relative to what we used to use. Now, if I understand right, I think still to this day, after glyphosate, the second most used chemical there is the atrazine. And we know what atrazine does. That's that old chemical that got into the rivers and was turning all the male frogs into female frogs, and I think they were growing extra legs. And I mean, glyphosate hasn't got to that point where we can, point to that canary in the frogs and the amphibians are always the canary in the coal mine, right? It's not like we can point there and say, look, this is what's happening, right? We have to dig a little bit, and I'm sure we will find it, right? But in comparison to what it had replaced, and a lot of the stuff went down into the roots, right? Or if you talk about, your pesticides as well, those things are crazy harmful to the environment. But if you're using Roundup, you actually can take care of a lot of that competition of the leaves and stuff. And I think that also simply because you have less species of plants, you therefore have also less species of pests and whatnot. But very complicated issue. And I think that we need to have that debate within that context. And if you can do it without glyphosate and do it well, absolutely. But if we're talking about the systems, and if you were to ask me, would you rather them be tilling that soil and knowing that a certain percentage of that soil, even if it says 10% or whatever, when we're going to be losing that soil every year, versus putting some glyphosate so that actually just the foliage gets taken down and the soil actually stays more intact than it would if you were in tilling, and you have erosion that's down to 3%. I don't know what the numbers would be, but I think if I was looking at, and that was the parameter of the discussion, then absolutely I would want to go with Roundup, right? Because then we would be mitigating the tilling. So so anyways, hopefully that wasn't too far of a diversion, but I just think that we need to approach these issues with a lot more knowledge and a lot more context, right? And so I'm going to move on, but I wanted to address one more thing that also tilling the soil and how it relates, because I'm always claiming that rotational grazing is sequestering carbon. And so I wanted to get a little bit more into what that is before I sign off here, and what's involved in that. And so I'm going to simplify this way too far, but essentially soils can, one way to look at soils is to see a spectrum of bacteria versus fungus. And if you look at like a forest and what's going on in there, the soil and the ecology there, it's vastly dominated by fungus. And if you get to a garden, or vegetable growing, then that is vastly dominated by bacteria. And so that's kind of the ends of the spectrum. And then if the pasture is kind of in the middle there, and it has, somewhere in the area vicinity of 50-50, where it has both mushroom or both fungal populations that are intact in bacteria. Now, what's going on with the vegetables and annual stuff, when it's not a perennial crop, it's not a perennial pasture, is again has to do a lot of function of just restarting over and over, right? And bacteria can reproduce so quickly and establish themselves very quickly, and the fungus actually takes a little more time to establish itself, and it needs not only a function of time, but it needs a stability where you're not disrupting the soil nearly as much. And why is that important? Well, the studies and the science that's coming out of it now is that and I don't understand it all, but for some reason, the fungus and the mushrooms that are in the forest aren't really sequestering carbon in the soil. But when you're talking about a pasture, there's the mycorrhizal, so that's the fungus that grows around the roots of the plants and grasses and whatnot there, and it has a symbiotic relationship. So, and it's at the tip of the root. So it's extending the roots in a sense. So its mycelia are going farther and gathering all these nutrients. But what goes on is that in exchange for these nutrients, the plant actually gives carbon to the fungus, to the mycorrhizal, and it's in a very stable form. And so a huge amount of that, when you say that you're sequestering carbon and you're building that soil, a large percentage of that, and I'm not sure of the numbers, which I probably should be better at all these numbers, but is actually what's going on with mushrooms, and actually what's going on with fungal. And it's all about this sort of little economies that are going on between roots and these organisms underneath the ground. And so essentially, and keep in mind for the next podcast, because I'm gonna get back to this. But essentially, much of what's going on is that the fungus, the mycorrhizal, is trading nutrients that the plant has a harder time to get, and it's trading those, and in return, the plant gives its carbon, and that carbon gets put into the soil. So it's a beautiful way to sequester carbon, and it does it far more efficiently than pretty much any system out there. So one more reason why the pasture in a perennial sort of system, and when it stays intact, has an advantage over that. When we're plowing and disturbing the soil, so that we only grow one type of thing. So that's kind of the summary of the first challenge, and we'll get to the next one another day. All right, thanks for listening. Bye.